I would like to welcome you to this panel on privacy and security issues in the connected health marketplace. My name is David Martin. I'm a senior legal officer at BEUC, the European Consumer Organization. First of all, I would like to thank Cpdp for hosting us, and also to American University for putting together this great panel, which I am very glad to chair. Before introducing our moderator and our panelists, I would like to underline how important this issue is from a consumer perspective. Health is one of the areas, if not the area, where we see that connected technologies can bring real benefits, not only to consumers, but to society as a whole. But also is one of those areas where the risks are extremely high. So the cost of, is the mic working? Yeah? Can you hear me? So the cost of doing things wrong can actually be really devastating for our rights and freedom. In case someone around here haven't heard the news yet, the GDPR is coming in May. And we, the consumer organizations, not only in Europe, but all around the world, we have high hopes that the GDPR is going to bring positive change to the marketplace and address some of the problems that we are actually seeing already now. And rest assured that if it doesn't happen, we are going to try to make sure that it does, that this change happens. I would move on now to introduce our panelists. First of all, I have Kathryn Montgomery, who's going to be our moderator today. She's a professor of communications at American University in Washington. In the 1990s, she spearheaded a national campaign that led to the passage of a historical federal law in the US, COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It was the first federal legislation to protect children's privacy on the internet. And she recently co-authored a report on emerging trends in health wearables and the connected health marketplace. Next, we have Finn Mistad, who's the head of the digital service section in the Norwegian Consumer Council, and who has kindly accepted to do a double act this afternoon and step in for a colleague of his who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And he's covering issues such as data protection, telecoms, digital rights in general in Norway and Europe. He's also the EU co-chair of the TACD InfoSoc working group. TACD is the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue. And he works on things like testing whether connected toys are respecting your children's privacy. They say that behind every great man, there's a great woman. Behind Finn, you might have heard of Kayla, my friend Kayla. He will tell us all about it afterwards. Next, we have Marijn Sachs, who's a PhD candidate at the Institute for Information Law in Amsterdam. You have to be aware, first of all, that he's not a lawyer, he's a philosopher, so he's going to bring a very interesting angle to this conversation. He has a background in political science and philosophy, and is mainly interested in questions concerning ethics, privacy, and technology. His research is focusing on health apps, and more specifically on the ethical dimensions of this new phenomenon and how ethical considerations can inform legal regulations. Next, we have Candace Martin. We are not related despite having the same surname. And she's a senior counsel, privacy and data senior counsel for privacy and data governance at Apple, a legal expert on a wide range of health privacy issues, and she received her law degree from New York University. And last but not least, we have Giuseppe D'Acquisto, who's a technology advisor for the Italian Data Protection Authority. He represents the authority within the technology subgroup of the Article 21 Working Party and the International Working Group on Data Protection in Telecommunications. He holds a degree in telecommunications and a PhD in computer science. And I will shut up for now and will give the floor to Kathryn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Is my mic working? It is. You can hear me. Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and it's just a real pleasure to have such an interesting and enthusiastic group of people to talk about this very important issue. I realized that there was a panel just in the previous session here that covered very similar topics, and so you may hear some themes that are similar to what you might have heard earlier if you were part of that, but there's plenty to talk about. and it's really a very important issue. If you want to, we're going to have to ask David, and he's kindly agreed to help us move the slides forward. So just to say a little bit about my involvement in this issue, which is fairly recent, just in the last couple of years, I've been looking at, with my colleagues at the Center for Digital Democracy, the emerging consumer health wearables market with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the US. And examining some of the major trends in that area, we were mainly looking at US, but we were very interested in finding out where this industry seemed to be going and what were some of the critical issues, particularly related to privacy, data protection, and security, and as well to issues of equity. And that report is available online. It was released in December of 2016, and there's been a huge amount of movement in this area. So as soon as you publish something, it's almost outdated. But I think it's worthwhile to read if you're interested in it. And I've just got an image here so you can easily find it. And I think it's also on the CDD website. It's also a microcosm, this issue of health wearables and fitness trackers and mobile health. They are all emblematic of the role of big data in our lives these days, and also this new era of the Internet of Things. And these technologies, all of these changes are transforming many, many aspects of our lives, as all of you know. So it's not just even the issues that we're talking about here are principally around health, but it affects the workplace, it affects education, politics, all sorts of aspects of our lives and our society. Next, if you can do, I can do it. That's right, I have power if I can figure out how to do it. There we are. So just a couple, what I wanted to just highlight a couple of trends really quickly so we can get the conversation going. This is a growing marketplace. In the US in 2016, reports indicate that something like almost 40 million adults are using wearable devices at least once a month. I have one. It broke. I told my colleague from Apple, but we're going to get it fixed. I've been assured it's going to be just fine. And we are also learning that young people between the ages of 18 and 34 are among the heaviest users. They're getting less expensive. We're expecting broader adoption of these devices, and it's moving, as some experts say, from a niche market to a mass market. Recent figures show that globally, 43 million smartwatches were shipped in 2017, and those sales are expected to grow dramatically in the next few years. So here are some of the key themes that I see as I look at this emerging marketplace. And I know we talked about this, we heard about this in the previous panel. Very clearly, there are wonderful promises that these new technologies, these new devices hold for us to really help improve our health. And that's a wide range of things, from the fitness trackers and watches to smart clothing to ingestibles. They can improve communication with doctors and patients. They can help us change our own behaviors and monitor what we're doing to prevent illnesses. They've also been lauded as hopeful, particularly for people with chronic illnesses. So there's a great deal of promise. But we also know that these devices, because of their capacities, are able to collect an unprecedented amount of data about us, and the kinds of data are uniquely unprecedented as well. So we're talking about not just health data, but actual biometric data from your own body, even behavioral, emotional behaviors, moods, all sorts of things that can be collected by these devices, and geolocation, among others. There are many more. We also need to understand them within the context of a growing connected health ecosystem with data flows that go from medical institutions to a number of institutions within the commercial sector, and an emerging dissolving of boundaries between these two sectors. And as we've heard previously, there's potential for discrimination that runs with a lot of the big data issues and the technologies in this era, as well as new forms of social control, which is one of the issues that's been raised. And we know as well that these devices will be used for marketing purposes, and maybe vehicles, and likely will be vehicles for marketing messages as well, that are highly personalized and potentially very intrusive. And in our examination of the current regulatory system in the United States, we found that the safeguards were highly ineffective, huge gaps, very, very ineffective. We're dealing with an environment that is lacking in regulations. We're more hopeful about how, Europeans, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the GDPR and how it will likely be able to help address some of these issues. And then finally, just quickly, the questions, the questions that I've identified, and there'll be many more here, we want to delve into that our speakers will talk about, delve into the safety and data protection issues raised by these devices. Interested in looking at sort of the comparative relationship between the consumer and medical sectors in the U.S. and the and European countries and elsewhere. As I mentioned, the effect of the GDPR and also the e-privacy directive and any other regulations. And I'm interested as well in the opportunities for developing global policies and practices for data and consumer protection in this emerging marketplace. I think we're in a unique moment to do that. So we've got a great group of speakers here. I've asked each of them to speak for 8 to 10 minutes approximately, and then when they're finished, we'll have an opportunity for a broader discussion and for questions and answers from the audience. It's doing okay till I put that down. Okay. And you have a mic, or I'll give you
my
mine.
turn. Okay, all right.
Here,
Okay, sorry.
Whatever mic you want.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. So I am supposed to be Kristin Wie, my colleague. She sadly couldn't be here, so I've accepted to take her place. But we work very closely together, so this is an area I'm quite familiar with. So for those of you who heard me earlier, I won't repeat too much of what I said there. What I'll do is I'll share with you some practical examples. In the Consumer Council, we do a lot of research. So we read the terms of service, we read the privacy policies, and then we work with security experts, and we analyze what's going on inside a device or inside an app. We look at data flows, we look at security issues, we look at the data flows and if they correspond with what's in the privacy policy, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff that no one has, as a normal consumer, has the ability to do. We try to take on that role a little bit. So we've done a bit of research into the area of health and the areas around. And of course, I just want to say the very obvious thing, which was Kathryn also said. There are lots of benefits to this in this field, and it's really important to stress that consumers are interested in this. They want to have services, digital health services, and in many cases, they can help in various ways of improving someone's quality of life and their health. Having said that, obviously it's a role of a consumer body to be an advocate for making things better. So we have some things we want to share with you. Oh, yes, I have to click.
Link.
Yeah.
That's how they did the
Here we go.
workaround.
Yeah, there were some technical issues with our formatting. So I want to start with the conclusion. ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Agency, have said many times that we are basically seeing a market failure when it comes to cybersecurity and privacy. What does that mean? It means that consumers are not fixing the market by buying products that are safe or privacy friendly. And why don't they do that? And I think that's very obvious for everyone here. It's because they are not empowered to do so. They're not able to do that. They're not able to read the terms of service and understand what's going on, often because the terms of service aren't available to them at the point of purchase, for example. And if you have bought a device and then you download and read, and obviously you're not a computer expert, so you can't see what happens. So we have a complete market failure in this area. And that, of course, has some consequences. What do we do with that market failure? And I'll get to that, but I'll have some proof points to back up this claim from ENISA. So we have done lots of research in this field, not more than others, but we've done a few things. What you see here is some blood pressure measurement tools and some blood sugar measurement tools. These can be very useful if you have diabetes or high blood pressure. And so we had a look at this, the health team and the digital team at the Norwegian Consumer Council, and we thought these are bought over the counter in stores, physical stores in Norway, and they're probably available in many other countries too, different variations. And they work with an app as well. So you buy them and you go home, and obviously you open the package and then you download the app. So when you've broken the thing, you read the terms, if you read the terms at all. And so we wondered, do they actually do a good job in measuring the health? The good news is they're actually super accurate. They do measure, and these are cheap products, 20, 30 euros. You wouldn't necessarily expect that they would measure the blood pressure in a good way. Our study shows that they do. And also the blood sugar. So it could be a very good tool for people with conditions that are related to this. However, so they were top-notch on health, check, but they were really, really poor when it came to privacy and security. We detected data flows of data going to China. That's not a country where the EU has an adequacy agreement, which means we cannot know that the data will be treated in accordance to European law. We also discovered that some of the apps were basically web apps, so they also imported cookies from the website of the different apps. So this is a diabetes app with 44 trackers. And these are trackers of huge marketing data broker companies that are instantly finding out that this is a person either with diabetes or at least of the interest of diabetes. And this is sent to 44 different commercial entities when you're using a diabetes app, which is often recommended to you by your doctor. Which brings me on to the next point, the role of the public sector. So this is in Norwegian, so I'll translate the major headlines. We also did a check of public websites. And we used a ad blocker to see what sort of trackers these websites are. These are websites that informs the public about mental health issues, drug abuse issues, child abuse, you name it. These are public websites. And we discovered that more than 20 public websites in Norway had these huge data broker companies on their websites. So they would know when you were clicking on mental health issues. Again, this becomes a part of the sort of profile that companies can make on you. This is not cool. Of course, we confronted these municipal websites with this, and it's a little bit better. But it brings me on to another issue of the role of the public. So I'm a very lucky man. I am going to be a father in 6 weeks. I was only managing, this was the last week I could leave home. So my wife said it was okay, you can go Finn, but be back on Friday. But it's been an interesting journey for me. It's the first time I have a baby. And I met with the public sector. And for those of you who were here on the previous discussion, we had a member of parliament who talked about the importance of the doctors. And I think they are huge influencers. And throughout the process of this pregnancy, we have been confronted with, at the doctor's office, at the hospital, with the midwife. They have all recommended to us lots of really cool apps. And what are these apps? These are apps for following your child's development. These are apps for when you are giving birth to count contractions so you know when to go to the hospital. All kinds of apps. And I asked my doctor, so these are really good apps for me to get in and make an informed choice. And obviously, I'm in a situation where I want to know as much as possible. How are the privacy policies and security implications of me downloading these apps? And obviously, they had no idea, sadly. And that brings me to a more general point of the role of the public sector. There was a report by the Electronic Frontier Foundation called the Pregnancy Panopticon. They looked at these pregnancy health apps, and they found that all of them had a varying degree of trackers on board, because new parents and pregnant people are the most valuable marketing group in the world. So it proves the point that health is big business. And one of my claims is that we need to move away, and the health industry that has a lot to gain from gaining the trust of consumers need to move away from this business model if they want this to be a successful transition, because it needs to be a business model based on giving a good service and providing good health. And I'm very happy that Apple is here on this panel, because from my knowledge of the health apps you've had many interesting solutions on storing data locally, for example, and not sharing data, and that's really, really good. The only disadvantage I see with the model is that obviously you need to buy a very expensive watch and it's not available for everyone. But at least you're setting a standard which is very good for others to follow. And the final point with the public sector is that they need to become a much better public procurement actor. They are buying health solutions across the board, big hospitals, and they need to have benchmarks for security and privacy, and they should not be going around recommending apps that will sell my privacy to the highest bidder. So that was the role of the public sector. Sorry. And then the last point is security. In not every case will a privacy issue and a security issue be the same thing. So we have the legislation called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which everyone here knows, but which will give the European population lots of new rights. And it will also give lots of possibilities for enforcement, which is good. And it will also cover security when it's related to data processing and personal data. But what it doesn't cover, as far as I know, is the issues when there's a pure security issue. So in the case of what you see here is a pacemaker. And there is a famous researcher in Norway, Marijn, who works at the research institution SINTEF, which managed to hack her own pacemaker because she's a researcher. And it says something about the implications this can have, and I think many people here are aware of it. And this is an issue that we have seen across the board when we've done our research. As I mentioned in the introduction, really good tools to help you measure things, but really poor on security. So I think this is where we really need to go one step further. Now that we're implementing the GDPR, we need to basically have a safety belt for IoT. And what I mean by that, in the old days, we had cars without a seat belt. And people died in accidents much more than they got injured. And then they, authorities said, we're going to have a seat belt, and all cars had a seat belt. Today, we have IoT devices, which are hugely important and has a great potential, but we don't have an effective system for ensuring a basic level of security, which again will ensure privacy. And I think this is really important that we move on this, and maybe within the health field, we can move into something about like mandatory certification, liability schemes, so that consumers can trust at the market, so we don't expect the consumers to do all this expensive testing that we have done and takes a lot of time. And I really want to get the European Union and, of course, progressive industry actors on board to do this. So we can, I think there's a lot of business potential in making sure that people trust these services and products. So that's the message. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, well, you start talking, I will fix.
Okay, we'll just click through then. Okay, so first of all, thanks for having me. And as was said in the introduction, I'm not a legal scholar, so don't expect any very deep legal reflections from my side. But I see it as my role to bring a, say, philosophical or ethical perspective to this phenomenon of mHealth. And coincidentally, my PhD project is about mHealth, so I hope I can dazzle you all. As the title of my presentation suggests, I would like to talk a bit about manipulation of consumers, or the possibility thereof, because I think that this is one of the important issues that we might overlook if we don't have the appropriate focus. So I just copied one of the key questions from the session. So what are the key safety and data issues raised by health wearable and other health connected devices? And I would argue that most of the time we seem to focus, and you might even say provocatively, we get stuck on informational issues, so issues of information and data. And I would say that that is, of course, a tremendously important and necessary starting point. But I would say that the next step we should take is to actually look into what those data enable companies to do. And I would say we have to look into behavioral issues or decisional issues, so how these apps can actually influence our behavior and our decisions, that's where the money is at. So shortly put, I would like to ask to think along with me about the issues of the manipulation of consumers. And I think the most important observation to make, the starting observation, is that most of the mHealth apps that we use can be downloaded in app stores. It literally is called the App Store and the Play Store. And I would say they are just commercial products, and we as users are simply consumers, just as we are users. And if you look at those apps, for instance, we are very popular apps like MyFitnessPal, like Fitbit, like Strava, like Endomondo, you name it. What many of those apps seem to do, at least what to me it seems they do, is that at the very same time they try to influence our health behavior as well as our economic behavior. And in many cases there seems to be a merging of both movements going on in the app. And to me, it's often unclear where the influencing of my health behavior ends and where the influencing of my economic behavior, so whether I sell products or engage with products, where that begins. And that's, of course, very understandable, because I would say there's an inherent incentive to try to engage in this merging of health and commerce in opaque manners, because it's, of course, not very... if you are an app provider, you want to sell stuff, you're not going to blatantly say, oh, by the way, I'm going to use a health app to sell you stuff. So, of course, these attempts to merge commerce and health are done in a pretty opaque fashion. And that also means that I propose that we should actually also look much more closer about what actually vulnerability means in the mHealth context. Because I think that if we look at vulnerability in a more precise and nuanced manner, we can also see that there is great potential for potentially problematic ways of manipulating users or consumers. Just as a tentative suggestion, I would say that we need to move away from the idea that vulnerability is just about, to put it a bit provocatively again, children and the elderly, and sometimes at least philosophers from the 18th century would say children and madmen. Those are, of course, they can be considered vulnerable, but I would actually propose that we come to understand that we are all always already vulnerable. Not all at the same moments or in the same circumstances or to the same degrees, but we are all potentially vulnerable. And I think that this should be reflected in both ethical analyses and ideally in legislation. And I think the European Commission also wrote a incredibly heavy, thick report where they basically made the same suggestion. We need a more dynamic understanding of vulnerability, because just focusing on children and the elderly is not going to cut it. And this is especially important in the mHealth sector, because these technologies are especially capable of identifying our very particular temporal vulnerabilities. So I've actually put my watch over here so I can track my time, but I'm literally wearing it all the time. I have a phone in my pocket and I have a lot of health apps for my research. They can track me all the time, and they can also target me all the time. So if they are able to find out and infer particular vulnerabilities, they can also reach me at those particular moments I'm experiencing those temporal vulnerabilities. So that's why I would say it's so important to move beyond the children and elderly vulnerability conception and see it as we are all vulnerable. And another point I would like to stress is that this is especially important because we are talking about the health domain. And health is not some unnecessary luxury that some want and others do not want to have. Health is actually quite literally of vital importance. You need your health to actually live and to live a life that is going well for you living it, so for your well-being. And that's why I think there's a big tension here, because it also makes it a particularly good vehicle to sell products, because health is as some philosopher of language would have it, a hooray concept. No one can have anything against health. We all want health, and that also is what makes it so attractive to use as a vehicle to sell products within those health apps. But at the very same time, that also makes us vulnerable because, of course, as we want to be healthy, we might also be more inclined to give in to suggestions that we need health products. So in conclusion, I would say that it's important to observe that there is technology available that is actually capable of knowing a lot about us, about our health, and that there are at the very same time commercial incentives to exploit this knowledge to present us with, for instance, native advertisement that can be used to, for instance, evoke in a certain desires for health products we might not necessarily want to have. And at the very same time, this all takes place in a domain that is basically of existential importance. We all want to be healthy. So I would say there's a very big risk of consumer manipulation here, more than in other sectors, I would say. And therefore, I would also like to stress that we need to really move beyond the informational perspective and delve into the behavioral or a decisional perspective. So we need to look at how these apps and these devices actually work together to influence our behavior. And of course, it's not necessarily bad. So I use a lot of health apps that help me. We all experience weakness of the will, and I experience weakness of the will, and my Strava app really helps me to go out for a run or to get my racing bike. So it's not all bad, but there is a very, very big risk, I would say. And one very last slide. So I'm not going to say anything about the GDPR, but I would like to stress that in line with what I just said, please look beyond data protection law. To me as a philosopher, the law is a complete social construct filled with tools that we can use. And the data protection law, the GDPR, is a very important tool. But I would really stress that, for instance, we have very interesting consumer law in Europe. So we have the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, which basically tries to establish when the influencing of a consumer is legitimate and when it's not. And coincidentally, that's exactly the ethical question that's also important. So I would really stress people to also look into, for instance, the question when something constitutes an aggressive commercial practice. So I would propose that if you actively try to evoke in people concerns for their health that might not be very realistic, you're actually engaging in an aggressive practice, which is, I believe, in America, it's very commonsensical to say you need to look into what's misleading. But anyway, so that's what I would like to say. And I will skip the examples, by the way. They can come in later.
You have a minute.
I think I will need more than a minute because it's...
You have 2.
Okay, then how do I go back? Could you maybe go back to one slide back, please? Yeah, okay, so this is a screenshot from the website of MyFitnessPal. It's not from the front page, but from their jobs page. And their search, the data scientist says that he is very passionate about his work, but he also says very interestingly that MyFitnessPal, which is a calorie counter, has the largest database in the world of human eating habits, which is a very nice observation to make. And of course, it provides lots of opportunities for data scientists, which I also believe. But I think if we contextualize this claim, you first have to observe that Under Armour bought MyFitnessPal for $500 million, not euros, $500 million. Which should suggest to you that maybe there's some profit to be made here. They also bought, by the way, Endomondo, MapMyRun, MapMyFitness, there's a whole MapMy something app family. For nearly €1 billion, they bought these apps and they bundled them into Under Armour Records, as you also explain in your report, by the way. And now, so they want to have this all-encompassing health, lifestyle, fitness experience. And Lee is Mike Lee, the founder of MyFitnessPal, and he's now the chief data something at MyFitnessPal. He's basically the CEO. And here he says, in an interview with Fortune, Lee envisions ways to further integrate the apps so that the data can be more closely linked than it is today. For example, after tracking a run on MapMyRun, MyFitnessPal could suggest local sports where other runners enjoy a post-workout snack. He also envisions MapMyRun data being used to help runners find popular courses in their neighborhood, or even setting up competition among local users. Now, in a way, this sounds very nice and benign, but I think there's an important suggestion here that there's an active move to try to integrate all these different apps and to, for instance, I would say it's very reasonable to say that if people are if they are running and after they've actually completed their run, they are exhausted, they are tired, they probably need to eat something because they need to feel better. And of course, if you bundle all these apps and you know what people's eating habits are, you know where they are because they've put on their GPS. This is a very, very potent tool to present them with sponsored, native, personalized advertising to suggest particular hip and happening spots around the block where you can have your actually healthy snack. It might be super useful to people, but these are the kind of examples where I get the feeling that there is a very, very big potential, at least, for manipulation that is very, very hard to resist. And that's why I think this is a very interesting example.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As David and Kathryn mentioned, my name is Candace Martin. I currently serve in the role of Senior Privacy Counsel at Apple. So in my role, I support Apple and its various health initiatives. The next 8 minutes are going to be a bit of a test for me because unlike the other panelists, I don't have slides. I was planning to just speak a bit about this topic as well as how Apple values privacy and security within our health features. So it'll be a bit of a test for me because at any given moment, I'm usually tied to around 6 different devices that go off at any point in time, be it my watch or my iPad or my phone. But I did want to thank Cpdp for inviting me to speak at this panel. I think it is a very, very timely subject. Over the last few years, as Kathryn has mentioned, we've seen a proliferation of the number of connected health devices, wearables, and mobile health apps. I think it goes without saying that these offer a number of great opportunities, both for consumers and healthcare professionals. On the consumer side, it gives you the chance to have at your very fingertips access to health and wellness information that traditionally you maybe did not have access to. It also gives you the ability to be able to effectively control and manage your own healthcare and take some responsibility and ownership for your own healthcare and wellness as well. On the provider side, with the increase in the number of connected health devices, it creates the opportunity for providers to have more access to more information and to be able to incorporate this into not only to the clinical care and treatment that they provide to patients. Now, understandably, with this increase in the number of devices and the access to the information, this raises a number of privacy and security challenges as well. That can be things from, as we think about the additional type of information that people now have access to and the increased sensitivity, as well as just the need for making sure and how do we ensure that users have transparency. I think as Finn had talked about in terms of what apps have access to their data, how will they use that data, how will that data be subsequently disclosed. In addition, we see an expansion of the type of entities that are actually now in this healthcare sector. We've moved a lot away from the traditional healthcare providers and healthcare entities to more of the mobile apps and technology companies being in this space. And this raises challenges because in many different legal environments, this type of data isn't currently regulated. For example, in the US, we have a federal health privacy regulation known as HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which imposes a set of privacy and security requirements on entities subject to the law. The current scope of that law is limited to traditional healthcare providers and health insurance companies as well as their vendors. So as we talk about the wearable space and the consumer health space, many of these entities might not be directly subject to the HIPAA requirements. I think this emphasizes the importance of developers and companies in making sure that privacy and security is incorporated into their products. And so I want to take a few minutes just to talk about how important privacy and security is to Apple and how we have very much thought about the importance of privacy and security in the health space and try to make sure that this is embedded in all the products that we offer to consumers. As a company, we deeply value the importance of consumers' privacy, and this is particularly the case with health information. We've focused on making sure that we've implemented privacy and security protections directly into our products, including things such as making sure that users have control of their health information, transparency, making sure that privacy and security are actually built into our products, and as well as realizing the sensitivity of this information, that there needs to be certain prohibitions around how this data can be used and subsequently disclosed. In 2014, we announced the Health app. For those of you who have an iPhone, you're probably very familiar with it. It's a native iOS app, which essentially serves as a personal health record, which allows you to control, manage, and view your health information. Embedded within the Health app, we incorporated a number of privacy and security protections because we really thought that this was very valuable given the increased sensitivity of this information. One of those being user control. So only apps that you have granted access to can actually view your health information, or as we say, read your health information, and they could also only write your information if you give them, write to your Health app if you give them permission to do so. We've also implemented very granular privacy controls. So if you look in your settings within the Health app, you're able to see within each individual app, what access they have, what data they have access to, and you're able to specifically control on the individual data level what data that they can actually read and write. So for example, if maybe I'm using a particular app and I'm comfortable with them having access to my workout information, but not my heart rate, I'm able to have that level of control. And we thought that that was something that was very important when we were developing this feature. In addition to user control, we also implemented a number of privacy and security protections within the app itself. So all data is encrypted. So when your phone is locked, either with a passcode, Face ID, or Touch ID, that data is encrypted within the Health app. We also thought that transparency was a very important piece to be incorporated into our products, and particularly within the Health app. So you're able to see, as I mentioned before, all the apps that have access to your health information and what specific information they have access to. In addition to our privacy policy, we also have a dedicated website which specifically speaks to our approach to privacy, and it goes by each of our different products, including our health products, about how we manage privacy and security protections as well. As an app platform, we also have a number of the third-party apps that are leveraging our platform and offering health apps as well. And so we thought that it was really important to incorporate a number of the protections that we value in terms of privacy and security for our own products to those apps as well. So if you look at the guidelines that we impose on app, we impose a number of health-specific, privacy-specific, and security-specific requirements on apps who are leveraging our platform. This includes requiring all apps to have who are leveraging the HealthKit APIs, to have a privacy policy, which must include certain information about how your data will be used and disclosed, who may have access to that data. We also require any apps that are leveraging the HealthKit API to explicitly commit to not using that data for marketing, advertising, or data mining purposes, which are some of the concerns that I know that you have raised, Finn, because we too view those as being important pieces. Similar to the health app, within the watch, we've implemented a number of privacy and security protections as well. That data is also encrypted. You control which apps are viewable on your watch. You also control which apps have access to your watch-related information. So as you can see, privacy and security are very important to Apple, particularly with our health features. And we've worked very hard to make sure that these protections are embedded into the products. And when we think about developing additional health products or additional health features, privacy and security are always top of mind for us. I think, as I mentioned, in terms of the privacy and security pieces, a number of the pieces that we've implemented closely align with the GDPR requirements. So that's one way to think about sort of the connection between our products and GDPR. So if you think about things such as transparency, user control, privacy by design, all pieces that GDPR emphasizes, those are pieces that we've already incorporated and highly value within our health products as well. I think as we see more and more of these wearables and consumer health generated devices coming into the market, which it seems like they will continue to come into the market over the years, we really think about and view the importance of making sure that privacy and security are incorporated into these products and technologies. And we view that these are very important things that need to be thought about as we design and develop additional health features and products as well.
Thank you.
Shall I start? Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, my perspective will be the perspective of a technologist working for a data protection authority. And the initial question of my analysis is going to be the following. What perception of the world will we have if all things that we wear and maybe ingest become capable of generating a vast amount of data relating to our life and health status? What are the effects on us coming from this super accurate description of the context where we live? Accuracy, as you all know, is an outstanding pillar of data protection. But what about super accuracy? Are we ready to deal with this? And let me start with an example. First slide. This is a non-wearable device, no doubt, an outside telephone that we used to have at home until 25 years ago. And this, next slide, is its wearable version. Telephone is the first technological complex object that in the last 25 years has become fully wearable and widely spread adopted. I guess that we all are wearing our mobile in this room. Well, if we observe the way this device became wearable, maybe we can derive some sort of archetypes which may be useful also for the analysis of other kinds of wearable devices in other sectors, such as health. Next slide. First of all, fixed telephone was a shared device, as you can see in the left-hand side of this slide, that used to process data of many persons, but not very capable of treating each in a different way. The ladies in the black and white picture were treated equally, and the telephone call might have been also a collective experience. On the contrary, Its wearable version is definitely more personal. Each lady in the other part of the picture keeps her own world in the device. And the use of the mobile is not a collective experience, and we do not share the device. So the first point that I want to highlight is the following. When devices become wearable, two big things happen. First, the device becomes a sensor of the context where we live, the digital context where we live. And second, the device becomes the door to get access to this context. Next slide. And this change is reflected in the economics. If you reflect on the fact that 25 years ago, the device was a commodity. The provider of the telco providers gave us the telecom almost for free. And the value was in the network. We paid a lot of money for switching and transmission. Today it is the opposite in the right part of the picture. The commodity is the network, which is almost for free. And the price, the value, is in the device and in the context which is kept in the device. And this is sort of a new form of lock-in for us, which is more contextual than technological. This is the archetype that I once mentioned before. Wearability of devices and super accuracy will generate a new, very powerful form of contextual lock-in. We don't want to abandon our context, never. And there are a lot of devices to make wearable still, and a lot of contextual lock-ins to build for the industries. Let's have a look. Next slide. We as workers. Next slide. We as writers. Next slide. We as gamers. Next slide. We as drivers. Even a car may become a wearable device if only myself I can unlock it with my fingerprint, and I cannot share with any other person. So the question is, can the number of digital contexts grow without any limit? Well, my answer to this question is no, because, next slide, we are limited. We have limited capabilities, limited behavioral capabilities. We cannot watch all the movies and read all the books. We have limited cognitive capabilities. We can predict to our best capability the next move, but not process any possible next 5 or 10 moves as an artificial intelligence can do. And we have limited budget capabilities. So what? Maybe today we are still far from these limits, and we perceive more the benefits of wearables than the threats. But when these limits are approached, we will start to feel a sort of erosion. So in the long term, we have to manage a sort of clash, a sort of saturation between limits and capabilities that need to be managed. And there's another aspect that I would like to highlight. If our margins are eroded, we will have less time and less money to redistribute. Our society will look very different than it is now, more selfish. So data protection in the long term might even become something to safeguard in the public interest, not just an individual fundamental rights. Now, what scenarios can we predict from this starting point? I know that it's always difficult and somehow arbitrary to make prediction, especially if they have to do with future, I know. But to my best capabilities, I see 3 possible scenarios here. First, a piling up of contexts. What does it mean? That the first device is for our social network, the second one for our well-being, the third one for gaming, and so on and so forth. Each device will take a part of our share in terms of time. 30 minutes for our social activities, 45 minutes for exercising, and so on. In this way, when the time is saturated, where we get to the limit, our next move will be predictable, will be directed by a clock, by a schedule. Maybe we will improve our health status, but we will be predictable. Each of us will have its own cluster, temporary cluster, until we meet the right parameters. After that, we will be moved to a less performant, for sure, because we grow old, cluster with less performant parameters. And what's the ending, the final scene of the movie? We might even be switched off at a certain point in time. This is the risk that we might face. Second scenario, which is a sort of variant of this first one, it's a piling up, but with decreasing margins, meaning that the first wearable will take 30 minutes, the second one will take 15 minutes, the third 5 minutes. At a certain point in time there will be no time less. And the next context, the next digital context to build will have zero economic value. So there will be a commoditization of digital context, which is very relevant as an economic impact, because there will be no incentive to innovate. And instead there will be a strong incentive to concentrate the industries, to put everything together in a single device. This is very much what is happening. The mobile device is becoming our everything, our life, where we put everything together. This is not too much different from reality. And moreover, a strong incentive for the creation of monopolies, no diversification, no different industries. Third scenario, a revolution. People, as their limits are approached, might react also with energy and might reject the new technologies. Some of us might even become sort of eremites, trying to resist to the temptation of the digital world. Now, most likely none of this scenario will materialize, and we will find an equilibrium somewhere in the middle. Why? Because all these scenarios will be driven by a single force, either the market force or the anger of the crowd. And we will need a regulation to find an equilibrium somewhere. And next slide, please. Technology runs very fast, and our capabilities grow slowly as a turtle, like in the famous Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the turtle. And we need a rule that is there to prevent that Achilles, or technology, actually reaches the turtle. A rule that does not discourage technology, but prevents technology to be attracted by our limits, as the two magnets in the top of the slide. We need to swap the magnets, as in the bottom of the slide, so that when technology approaches our limit, we can push the limit a step ahead. So we are never reached by technology. And the GDPR, I think, has these potentialities in the long term. And I would like just to mention, in conclusion, 4 big pillars of the new legal framework in Europe that are very relevant for this scope. The first is accountability. Second is privacy by design, then security, and fourth, the right to object to automatic decision. Let me elaborate a little bit on each of them. Accountability, as it is stated in Article 24, means being proactive in demonstrating compliance, but interpreted the way I trying to explain is also a way to be respectful of data and gentle towards person, abstaining from aggression. In my view, there cannot be any serious and long-lasting digital economy that can be based on the aggression to personal data. It's more productive for controllers to be accountable in the long term. And also privacy by design is a way to not invade our margins, not to be super accurate if it's not needed, with pseudonymization, with anonymization. It's a way to respect our limits. Security is a principle, is a new principle in general data protection regulation, Article 5. Not just a collection of technical and organizational measures. 2 minutes and I'm done. It's not a way to just prevent intrusions, but is a way to build trust between us and the providers of our services. And finally, the right to have a human intervention in automatic decision. Cold decision will bring controllers and data subjects to a clash, which is something to avoid in the long term, not a very forward-looking option. In conclusion, just 2 messages. As I said, when objects become wearable, and super accurate, there is a new threat of contextual lock-in, which is much stronger than technological lock-in. This is why we need accountability more than control. Someone said before that we want health, so our control will bring us to the use of these devices. We need accountability. And also, there is a risk of super accuracy, not using devices as sensors, but becoming ourselves sensors. And the border between these two scenarios is vanishing, and we have to be really forward-looking, not to misinterpret one for the other. I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. All right. Thanks very much to all of you. I think we have about, what, 15 minutes? I can't see my clock here. Minutes. Oh, we have about 20? Okay, good. So I would like to open it up to questions from the floor, and if I also have some of my own. Jeff, is that you, Jeff, in the background? Yes. Is there a mic? Oh, we take that mic. All right, that's great.
Thank you.
There you go. Okay.
I have to say this anyway. Fantastic panel, but I really do thank you. I want to ask you about digital marketing, digital advertising, both from the U.S. and the EU perspective, and also, you know, Apple's perspective as well. Because what we found in the study on in the United States was a very vibrant digital health and pharma marketing system that, under the radar of regulators, because we really don't have any privacy regulation in the United States, was using the most powerful digital marketing tools, programmatic advertising, to target you if they identified you as having cancer, diabetes, cholesterol problems, and having access to all the data. So, and digital marketing, digital advertising is the basic business model that that fuels the global digital advertising system by and large. So, in Europe, you know, Giuseppe, how do you think the GDPR is going to address the role that digital advertising plays in the health sphere, including the fact that this is highly sensitive data, right, under the GDPR? If there's time, you know, if you want to talk about the United States, that's fine. But Apple, how does Apple intend to, you know, kind of how does Apple intend to really address the enticements of the digital advertising and health services marketplace as it tries to expand its both medical and consumer health, you know, services, applications, and devices?
Okay, who wants to answer that first? I think anybody can address that question, so whoever would like to, but you specifically asked a couple of our panelists, so. Yes, Giuseppe?
Well, I think that GDPR reinforces the principles of the directive in this area. In the directive, marketing-based activities were based on consent, and the same it is for GDPR. So the role of persons to whom data relate to will be the focus, the center. So there is room to be optimistic. And also our experience as data protection authority should lead us to be optimistic, because as you might know, and I'm sure you know, we were involved in an activity jointly with other DPAs, the main DPAs, the biggest DPAs of Europe, towards Google. And we succeeded to change a very, business model which has been there for a long time. So in the past, the business model of Google was not based on consent. And after our action, it became based on consent. There is a dashboard. There are measures which provide safeguards to people. They are adopted. They are usable, I would say, with the action of our technologists of the DPAs. So I think that there is margin to be optimistic. Of course, there is a problem related to the fact that these devices are going to be very small. There is an issue related to the usability, to the user interfaces, but these are technicalities. If we have to relate to the principles, I think that the principles are sound, and there are rooms to make them come true, in a sense, okay?
So to answer sort of your question around the marketing and advertising piece, I think, you know, as we entered this space and as we saw the proliferation of these health applications, we recognize that one of the main concerns, given the sensitivity of this data, is the potential use of this data for marketing and advertising purposes. And as I mentioned before, in our app guidelines that we impose on third-party app developers, one of the specific prohibitions is prohibiting them from using health data from the health app for marketing and advertising purposes. Similarly, as a company, we understand and we value the importance and sensitivity of this information, and recognizing that there are concerns about using this data and the potential for this data to be used for marketing and advertising purposes. That's why we design our products with certain privacy and security protections in place. And as a company, a lot of the processing is done on device. That data is encrypted, for which, cases which we don't have access to. So we really have thought very thoughtfully about sort of the concerns and the sensitivity of this data, particularly as it relates to marketing and advertising uses.
Candace, can I just follow up a little bit? Because when you were talking about that, I wanted to ask you, you make these requirements of your third-party apps. Do you have a mechanism for monitoring or enforcement to ensure that things don't change, that they continue to abide by your rules?
So obviously these are requirements that are imposed on any app that wants to be in the App Store itself. And so if we were to become aware of a potential of an app that was using this data for marketing or advertising purposes, then we obviously have the ability to enforce up to removing that particular app from the App Store itself.
Thank you, Jeff, for your questions. And I'd love more comments. I see many hands here, so I'll be very quick. I think we have to sort of go back a little bit. This is privacy is a fundamental right. And so we need to really sort of try to address it from that point of view when it comes to enforcement and when we make policies going forward. And I think the harms are obvious. I mean, discrimination when it comes to insurance, exclusion, reinforcing habits, et cetera, being excluded from the job market as a result of this data being sort of shared. So I think we need to also then move to the solutions. And we spoke about market failure. And I think the issue of enforcement is really important. I think the DPAs need to be strengthened. And then you need to have more people who are technologists, and but also people who understand business models. Because the business models is where you can often understand what is the, if it's free, there's something wrong, right? We all know that, but what is the business model? And I think this has been why we have been, consumer groups too, have been, we've been probably not doing as good a job as we could have, understanding what are the business models. We really need to look into that and then sort of go at that. And that's why I liked your point regarding using consumer law to sort of strike down when there's not necessarily a data breach. But with GDPR, there, of course, are some new opportunities as well. I'd love to challenge Apple a little bit. I really like what you're saying about how you use encryption and have lots of measurements with your own apps. I would love to be in a dialogue with you as a part of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, as a Norwegian Consumer Council, on how you can do even more in your app store. We challenged Google on this a few years ago. We actually didn't challenge you because we felt Google was so far behind when it came to, really their app store and also how the Android operating system does not give the same amount of controls on the apps that actually the Apple operating system does. But there are some things you could potentially do, because what we've seen in our research when it comes to terms and conditions and lots of other things, we see that the terms are really horrible. So what if we could, in the code or in the requirements to be in the App Store, they have to answer 5 questions. Will you change the terms without giving notice? Yes or no? If they say we will not give notice, then they're not allowed into the App Store, because that's a breach of the Unfair Contract Terms Directive of the EU. You should always give notice in advance before changing the terms, for example. Will you delete data after a certain amount of time, for example? Again, in application of EU law, the right to have your data deleted. There's a few things. I think there could be very small steps. I know there is a huge discussion about being a gatekeeper and all of this, but I think these are basic requirements of the law today, which we effectively could basically take out a lot of apps that are breaching the law. And I think we could raise the bar significantly and really enforce the industry. That would be a really quick win. and easy to do while we're waiting for more enforcement and hopefully better regulation when it comes to security, for example. But we really would love to have you on board and sort of also force the other big actors there to really take this seriously.
Okay, other questions? Yeah.
Yes, hello. Eva Lievens from Ghent University. Kathryn, at the start you mentioned that a lot of 18 to 25-year-olds use these apps, but I think also a lot of under 18-year-olds use it, children, from the moment they get these smartphones. So I'm just wondering what the panel thinks about stronger protection for children in particular. I understand from the presentations that everyone needs to be protected more, everyone needs to be treated as consumers, but the GDPR also provides for opportunities for stronger protection for children, I think. And I'm just wondering how the panel sees this.
Well, let me just respond quickly. Thank you for your question. You know, I think I'm very was interested in the point about vulnerabilities that all of us have, not just children and the elderly, and I think I might fit in that latter category now. And I guess I am vulnerable. But there are particular vulnerabilities that children still have, and I do believe they need to be addressed in very specific ways. And the GDPR does have mechanisms that could be used to be focused on wearables and on mobile apps in particular, and I think there's a need to do that. And we also know that young people, and you're right, younger and younger kids are using mobile as their primary device. So there need to be protections there to begin with and effective enforcement of the new protections coming into play. But in addition to that, I think thinking about the issues of health information, and particularly the very sensitive kinds of behavioral and emotional sorts of tracking that I mentioned earlier, are particularly critical for young people, and I think that needs to be really looked at very closely. I don't know if anybody else wants to answer the question.
Yeah, maybe if... Oh yeah, it's on, okay. So, yeah, I didn't want to suggest, of course, that the fact that we are all vulnerable means that there should not be extra or more attention for instance, the extra vulnerable, like children. And I would like to point attention to something else that I see in mHealth apps and in the devices that come with them, namely that there's a catch-all, very expensive idea of what health means. So basically health is being conflated with just your lifestyle. And although I'm not a social psychologist, I do get the feeling, I've been a child quite recently, that you are as a child quite susceptible to influences when it comes to social status, what you look like, what friends you have, what place you go to. And the more health seeps into this lifestyle concept, I would say there's also even more potential for influencing children in a very problematic way. Yeah, I would leave it at that, looking at the time.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Somebody else had their hand up. Yes, you right there.
Thank you. Andrew Adams, Major University. I actually wrote on a related issue to this back in 2007 on the ethical implications of ubiquitous computing, as it was called back then, now often used IoT, for medical applications. And one of the things I talked about then was the fact that we have a significant problem, and I think this is still true over 10 years later, between the general tenets of information ethics and the general tenets of medical ethics. And I'm still seeing this, I think, from this panel, that a lot of the work in this area is being driven still by the information ethicists without enough input from the medical ethicists, I think, because there's a whole different set of tenets there. The ideas of autonomy, but balancing that much more with the duty of care. And I think that these still need to be brought in more into these debates when we're talking about health applications. We need really to bring in the medical ethicists and the medical law experts much more, and not just focus on privacy law and information ethics.
Other responses?
I agree.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good point.
I feel compelled to say something since I'm an ethicist, although I'm not a medical ethicist. But I would say that one interesting, so you mentioned autonomy, I would say one interesting venue to explore is to move away from the old school conceptions of autonomy, pristine autonomy, where all the lone rangers in the desert being completely independent. We can make all the choices we want without influences and move towards more relational conception of autonomy. So to emphasize that we are all embedded in relational networks, we are never completely autonomous, and for good reasons, because one, we cannot be completely independent, and secondly, because it is simply unattractive to be completely independent. So then the question focuses not so much on the very issue of interfering with people's autonomy or with their decisions, but with the question, to what extent and for what reasons can you influence someone's decision making? So if you do from a care perspective, if you really care for the person, then it's largely unproblematic, whereas if you do it for, you could say, manipulative reasons, so if you want to manipulate people into having certain ideas about their own health so that they can consume your product, then it obviously is problematic. So you shouldn't insist that influencing decision making itself is problematic, but that the way it is done is problematic.
Okay. Does that mean did that mean something?
5 minutes.
Oh, okay. I can never tell what that was beeping. I'm not wearing it, I know that. So I think there's another question out there, so please.
Thanks for this very nice discussion. There is one privacy threat that hasn't been discussed here. Of course, there is the data that is collected by those devices that go somewhere on the internet, in the cloud, something that can be used. But there is also the fact that those devices are connected using Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And the mere fact that this Wi-Fi or Bluetooth connection exists, sometimes the devices, they advertise their presence. So if you use a Bluetooth scanner, you can look around and see all the devices that are around you. And when this device is, for instance, a tensiometer or glucometer, anything, you are basically saying to all the people around that you have this kind of disease. So you are basically advertising to anybody that you are suffering something. And I was wondering, is this something, what do you think about that? And do you know if there is any protection apart from the technical one to, of course, stop this broadcasting or personal data? So have you think about anything on this field?
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. There was the first panel at Cpdp yesterday was on physical tracking. And if right. And I think this is a super interesting question because you're moving into a public space or anywhere and you're basically being tracked from the second you walk in. There's no opt-out. There's no, either you're there or you're not. I think this is it was an eye-opener for me at least, the amount of tracking. And then obviously your phone has a unique ID as well. And then all your online activities from all the data brokers are instantly matched with your identity where you are physically. So this is a huge challenge. And I didn't completely hear everything you said about but I would love to. We would love to know more about it. And I think this is also for an issue of enforcement with GDPR because there's no such thing as informed consent at this point. And also, I think it breaches purpose limitation. It breaches a whole lot of rules with the GDPR. So that was my thought. But there's also,
if I may, just 1 minute. This topic is covered by the e-privacy regulation proposal. There's an Article 8, which has to do with the emitted data from devices. And this article, at least in the proposal that we have right now, says that the only valid reason for using this data is for connecting the device to the network. And other reasons should be really considered as an exception. And none of the exceptions which are envisaged today have to do with the possibility to learn something about the status of the person and about the health status of the person. So I cannot agree more with your observation.
I think we have time for one more question. And it has to be a quick one.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. I just want to ask you, maybe you know about approaches for the data protection concerning Internet of Things, devices for pets. When device collects data about location of pets and if this data can be concerned as personal data, because...
And I think that's a GDPR also question, right? To what extent is it going to protect people from these kinds of data collection with Internet of Things? Who wants to answer that? Do you want to answer that?
The responsibility to label data related to pets as personal data. I will not
I mean,
take the responsibility.
I mean,
It's
if
a
you
good,
have
good idea, but we have to reflect on this.
if you have a pet, the location of your pet can be location of you.
Yes,
So
that's true. Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. So lots more we can talk about over cocktails or coffee or whatever it is. But I do want to thank all of the panelists and David as well for a very interesting conversation. And thank you also.